The silence in a room where a dream is dying has a specific suffocating weight that no one warns you about. It is not the peaceful quiet of a library or the restful stillness of a sleeping forest. It is a heavy, pressurized atmosphere that makes every breath feel like you are inhaling lead dust. We find Leo submerged in this pressure, lying horizontally across a bed that has become less of a piece of furniture and more of a life support system for his stagnation. His eyes are fixed on the ceiling, tracing the hairline fractures in the plaster, seeing in them a map of the cracks in his own fractured ambition. To the outside world, Leo is a young man with potential, a word that has slowly transformed from a compliment into a cruel, recurring taunt. Inside his skull, the prefrontal cortex, the CEO of the brain, is currently being held hostage by a rebellious and hyperactive limbic system. This primitive region is screaming for the safety of the known, the comfort of the soft mattress, and the sugary hit of another digital distraction. Leo's heart isn't physically diseased, but it is lazy, a psychological state where the desire for the trophy has completely detached from the willingness to run the race. He is currently experiencing a massive surge of glutamate, the brain's primary excitatory neurotransmitter, but it isn't being channeled into action. Instead, it is fueling a loop of analysis paralysis, where he envisions every possible failure before he has even laced up his shoes. He feels the phantom itch of 1,000 unwritten lines of code and the ghost of a business plan that exists only in the ether of his imagination. Every time he thinks about swinging his legs off the bed, a wave of cortisol, the stress hormone, washes over him, convincing his body that the floor is made of jagged glass. This is the visceral reality of the high-potential procrastinator. The mind is a Ferrari, but the transmission is filled with sand. He is not relaxing. He is actually exhausted from the sheer cognitive load of avoiding his own life. The blue light from his discarded phone reflects in his pupils like the glow of a distant, unreachable star. He remembers being 12 years old and believing that the world would simply yield to his brilliance because he was gifted. Now, at 24, he is discovering that the world doesn't care about gifted people who stay in bed until noon. The tragedy of Leo is that he is fully aware of his own decay, yet that awareness only serves to deepen the shame that keeps him paralyzed. He is a ghost haunting his own youth, waiting for a permission slip from a universe that stopped writing them a long time ago. Leo's room is a graveyard of abandoned interests, each one a testament to a week where he felt inspired before the dopamine wore off. There is a guitar in the corner with 3 missing strings, a reminder of the month he decided he would be a virtuoso until his fingertips began to callous. There are stacks of expensive textbooks on machine learning with spines that have never been cracked, their covers gathering a fine gray veil of dust. His desk is a chaotic landscape of half-finished sketches and empty energy drink cans, the physical residue of all-nighters that were spent researching how to be productive instead of actually producing. This environment is a feedback loop of failure, constantly triggering his hippocampus to recall past moments of quitting. Every object in his line of sight sends a signal to his brain that effort is a precursor to disappointment. He has developed a conditioned taste aversion to hard work, treating the sensation of mental friction as if it were a literal poison. When he smells the stale air of his room, his brain immediately prepares for a day of low arousal activities, effectively shutting down his motor neurons before he even tries to move. He tells himself he is a perfectionist, a clever lie the ego uses to hide the fact that he is simply terrified of being mediocre. If he never finishes anything, he can remain a hidden genius in his own mind rather than a novice in the real world. This is the dark side of neuroplasticity. Leo has physically wired his brain to find safety in incompletion. His neural pathways for avoidance are like well-paved highways, while his pathways for persistence are overgrown, narrow trails. He is a victim of his own efficiency, as his brain has become world-class at finding reasons to do nothing. Even his dreams have become a form of escapism, a way to experience the neurochemistry of success without the metabolic cost of achievement. He spends hours in maladaptive daydreaming, constructing elaborate scenarios where he is being interviewed about his sudden meteoric rise to fame. In these fantasies, the work is already done. The sweat has been wiped away, and only the applause remains. But when the fantasy ends, the silence of the room returns, more deafening and more accusatory than before. He feels a sharp, localized ache in his chest, a psychosomatic manifestation of a heart that is starving for a purpose it refuses to pursue. He is 24, and he is already tired of a life he hasn't even begun to live. The cycle usually breaks only when the hunger for food outweighs the hunger for self-preservation, or when his mother knocks on the door with a voice full of suppressed disappointment. Today, the knock is different. It is soft, hesitant, and carries the weight of someone who has finally given up on asking, "What are your plans?" Leo feels that silence through the wood of the door, and it hurts worse than a shouting match would have. It triggers his anterior cingulate cortex, the part of the brain that monitors social exclusion and emotional pain. He realizes that he is no longer the golden boy in his family's eyes. He is a problem to be managed, a dynamic that makes him want to curl into an even tighter ball. He is experiencing reward devaluation, where even the idea of a good meal or a walk outside feels like too much effort for too little gain. This is the neurochemical signature of a lazy heart. A state where the brain as internal currency is so devalued that no goal seems worth the energy. He thinks about his friends who are starting law firms or getting promoted, and he feels a surge of schadenfreude when they fail, because their failure validates his inaction. It is a toxic, rotting way to live, but it is the only way he can keep his self-esteem from bottoming out entirely. He is trapped in a static equilibrium, where the pain of staying the same is finally starting to equal the pain of changing. He watches a spider on the ceiling, marveling at its mindless, repetitive industry as it weaves a web to catch nothing. At least the spider is participating in its own biology, he thinks with a bitter, internal laugh. He is an apex predator with the drive of a houseplant, a biological contradiction that is slowly tearing his psyche apart. He closes his eyes, hoping for sleep to claim him, but his brain is too wired on its own anxiety to grant him the mercy of unconsciousness. This is the threshold, the moment where the pressure of the unborn giant inside him becomes too great for the vessel to hold. He is about to learn that if you don't use your heart to drive your life, life will use its weight to crush your heart. The lesson is coming, and it will not be televised, nor will it be gentle. It will be a cold, hard collision with a reality that doesn't care about his big dreams or his lazy heart. The morning of the transformation did not arrive with a golden sunrise, but with the gray, sterile light of a Tuesday that felt like a funeral for Leo's youth. He found himself standing in front of his bathroom mirror, staring at a face that looked 10 years older than his birth certificate claimed. The skin beneath his eyes was a bruised purple, a physical manifestation of the oxidative stress caused by months of erratic sleep and chronic self-loathing. He noticed a slight tremor in his hands as he splashed cold water on his face, a sign that his nervous system was perpetually stuck in a low-grade state of freeze, one of the primary components of the stress response. His brain was currently a battleground of neurochemistry, where the dwindling supplies of serotonin left him feeling emotionally brittle and exposed. He reached for his phone, the modern-day talisman of the distracted mind, and saw a notification that would act as the catalyst for his internal revolution. It was an invitation to a high-profile industry gala hosted by Elias, a man Leo had spent years dismissing as a plodder with half his intellectual capacity. Elias had been the student who stayed behind to ask questions while Leo was already out the door, confident he had mastered the material by osmosis. Now, the invitation stared back at Leo with the cold, unblinking eyes of a victor, forcing a massive spike of norepinephrine to surge through his veins. This chemical, responsible for arousal and alertness, finally broke the dam of his lethargy, replacing his usual apathy with with a sharp, stinging clarity. He realized that while he had been curating his genius in the dark, Elias had been out in the world, building a legacy with the bricks of his own sweat. The cognitive dissonance was almost physical, a grinding sensation in his chest as his ego struggled to reconcile his perceived superiority with his actual stagnation. He looked at the mess of his apartment, the overflowing trash, the unwashed laundry, the digital ghosts of unfinished projects, and felt a wave of nausea. His amygdala, the brain's emotional smoke detector, was finally screaming that the house was on fire. And for the first time, Leo didn't try to ignore the alarm. Leo decided he would attend the event, not out of a sense of celebration, but as a form of self-inflicted penance. He needed to see the physical evidence of what a non-lazy heart could accomplish when paired with even a modest intellect. As he dressed in a suit that was now slightly too tight around the waist, he felt the weight of his own metabolic syndrome, a byproduct of his sedentary, avoidance-based lifestyle. His brain was suffering from a lack of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, the protein responsible for repairing neurons and fostering new connections. Because he never pushed his physical or mental limits, his brain was effectively pruning away the very pathways he needed for success. He drove to the venue in a state of hypervigilance, his sensory systems dialed up so high that every street lamp felt like a searchlight. When he walked into the gala, the sheer sensory input of successful people, expensive perfume, and confident laughter hit him like a physical wall. He watched Elias move through the crowd, noticing how he didn't have the frantic energy of a striver, but the calm, grounded presence of a master. This presence is actually a signature of a well-regulated vagus nerve, the highway of the parasympathetic nervous system that allows a person to remain calm under social pressure. Elias was a living example of deliberate practice, the concept that high-level skill is the result of thousands of hours of uncomfortable, focused effort. Leo's internal narrator, usually so full of witty excuses, was suddenly terrifyingly silent. He stood by the bar, holding a sparkling water with white-knuckled intensity, feeling like an interloper in a world he was supposed to own. He realized that the talent he had prized so much was a currency that had been devalued to zero in the real world. Only output mattered here, and Leo's output for the last 3 years was a vacuum. The turning point came during the keynote speech, when Elias stood on the podium and spoke about the sanctity of the grind. He didn't talk about passion or dreams. He talked about the thousands of mornings he wanted to quit and the hundreds of times he felt like a failure. He spoke about the dopaminergic cost of ambition, explaining that you have to be willing to feel low for long periods to eventually reach the high of achievement. Leo felt every word like a needle piercing a blister, draining the fluid of his self-delusion until only the raw red truth remained. He looked at his own hands and realized they hadn't done a single hard thing in years. They were soft, shielded from the friction of reality. This realization triggered a process in his brain called reappraisal, where the ventromedial prefrontal cortex begins to change the emotional meaning of a stimulus. The envy he felt for Elias began to transform into a grim, dark form of inspiration, a shadow motivation that was more powerful than any positive thinking. He left the gala before the applause ended, walking out into the cold night air with a heart that felt like it had been restarted by a defibrillator. He didn't feel good or happy. He felt a terrifying, focused rage directed entirely at the man he had allowed himself to become. He drove home in silence, his mind already beginning to map out a neuro-rehab plan for his own willpower. He knew that the first few weeks would be a chemical war zone as his brain fought to maintain its lazy equilibrium. He would have to deal with dopamine crashes and the physical agony of focus, but for the first time, he welcomed the pain. The lazy heart was being forced into a marathon, and Leo was no longer going to let it stop until it learned how to beat with a purpose. He walked into his apartment, turned off his phone, and sat at his desk, staring at the blank screen until the sun began to rise. This was day 0, the first day of the rest of his life, or the last day of his sanity. He didn't care which. The first 48 hours of Leo's transition felt like a violent detoxification from a drug he didn't even know he was taking, the drug of chronic comfort. As he sat at his desk, the silence of the room began to roar, a phenomenon where the brain, deprived of its usual high-stimulus input, begins to amplify its own internal noise. His prefrontal cortex was attempting to exert top-down control over his behavior, but his basal ganglia, the ancient seat of habit, was screaming for a return to the status quo. He felt a physical restlessness in his legs, a manifestation of the low dopamine state that occurs when you strip away the instant gratification of social media and mindless scrolling. This is the extinction burst, a psychological term for the way an old habit gets more intense right before it finally breaks. Leo's brain was attempting to trick him into believing that he was actually ill, inducing a phantom headache and a deep, gnawing fatigue to force him back to the safety of his bed. Every time he reached for his phone, he had to manually intercept the signal, a process that burned through his limited supply of executive glucose at an alarming rate. He was experiencing ego depletion, where the mental energy required for self-control starts to run dry, leaving him feeling raw and emotionally exposed. He looked at the clock and realized only 12 minutes had passed since his last check, a terrifying revelation of how distorted his perception of time had become. He felt the cold sweat of a man trying to outrun his own biology, realizing that his lazy heart was actually a sophisticated defense mechanism designed to keep him from ever feeling the sting of effort. He had to learn to view this discomfort not as a sign to stop, but as a biological marker that the rewiring was actually taking place. The struggle wasn't a side effect. The struggle was the work itself. By the third day, the mental fog began to thicken into a dense, gray wall of cognitive resistance, making the simplest tasks feel like solving a Rubik's Cube in the dark. Leo was trying to write the first module of his software, but his working memory, the mental scratchpad located in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, seemed to have shrunk to the size of a postage stamp. He would hold a variable in his mind, only to have it evaporate the moment he tried to connect it to a function, a result of his brain's reduced synaptic plasticity. He was paying the interest on years of intellectual debt, and the collection agency was his own frustrated nervous system. He felt a surge of learned helplessness, a state where the brain convinces itself that no amount of effort will change the outcome, leading to a profound sense of despair. To combat this, he began a practice of microtasking, breaking his goals down into units so small they were impossible to fail at. He wasn't building a platform today. He was just writing one line of clean, functional code. This approach allowed him to harvest tiny, microdoses of dopamine, the neurotransmitter of reward and motivation, which acted as a chemical ladder to climb out of the pit. He realized that the lazy heart is often just a heart that is overwhelmed by the sheer scale of its own mountains. By focusing only on the next 6 inches of the climb, he bypassed the amygdala's fear response and kept his action outcome circuits firing. He started to notice a strange, quiet satisfaction in the completion of these small tasks, a feeling that was different from the hollow high of his previous fantasies. It was a grounded, heavy sense of reality, the feeling of a stone being placed firmly on top of another stone. He was no longer a dreamer. He was a mason, and the structure he was building was his own character. As the first week drew to a close, Leo encountered the Friday slump, a massive dip in serotonin and norepinephrine that made him feel as though his very soul had been hollowed out. The initial rage-fueled motivation from the gala had evaporated, leaving him in the neutral zone where the old life is gone, but the new life hasn't yet taken root. This is the most dangerous period for any transformation, the point where the lazy heart tries to negotiate a compromise, suggesting that a small break won't hurt. Leo felt the siren call of his old habits, the seductive pull of a cheat day that would inevitably turn into a cheat month. He looked at his hands, which were now slightly calloused from the unconscious way he gripped his desk when the urge to quit became too strong. He realized that discipline is not a feeling you wait for, but a pre-commitment strategy you employ when you feel nothing at all. He began to practice intertemporal choice, forcing himself to visualize the future Leo of 10 years from now, either broken and bitter or strong and successful. By making the future version of himself feel real to his medial prefrontal cortex, he was able to make the present-day sacrifice feel more logical. He chose to stay at the desk, not because he was inspired, but because he was unwilling to murder the man he was becoming. The lazy heart finally began to go quiet, not because it was gone, but because it was being starved of the attention it required to survive. He was learning the most important lesson of the grind, that the person you become while doing the work is far more important than the work itself. As he finally closed his laptop on Sunday night, he didn't feel like a winner, but he felt like a soldier who had survived the first week of a very long war. The second week of Leo's transformation brought with it the arrival fallacy, the cruel psychological trick where the brain expects a massive external reward simply because it has survived a few days of internal effort. Leo woke up expecting the world to have shifted on its axis, expecting his bank account or his social status to reflect his newfound discipline, but the world remained stubbornly indifferent to his private struggle. This indifference triggered a massive drop in his tonic dopamine levels, the baseline of motivation that keeps us moving toward a goal. When the reward prediction error is negative, meaning you worked harder than the results suggest you should have, the brain's anterior cingulate cortex registers this as a form of social pain or physical injury. Leo felt a wave of profound lethargy wash over him, a chemical hangover from the intense effort of the previous 7 days. His mind began to manufacture reasons why this new path was futile, whispering that he was merely a lazy man playing dress-up and that his true nature would eventually reclaim him. This is the moment where the lazy heart tries to reassert its dominance by using logic against the soul, pointing out the vast distance between Leo's current reality and Elias's success. He felt the temptation to retreat into passive consumption, to lose himself in a movie or a game just to stop the persistent ache of being a beginner. He was standing on the plateau of latent potential, where the work is being done, but the results are not yet visible to the naked eye. To survive this, Leo had to decouple his effort from his immediate emotional state, a process known as emotional regulation, governed by the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. He had to learn to work, not because he felt like it, but because he had contracted the work to himself as a non-negotiable debt. Just as Leo was stabilizing his internal ship, life delivered a catastrophic external blow. His laptop, the singular tool of his liberation, suffered a hardware failure that erased 48 hours of unbacked-up code. He stared at the black screen, feeling the cold, prickling sensation of a cortisol spike that made his breath hitch in his chest. In the past, this would have been the perfect excuse to quit, a sign from the universe that he wasn't meant to succeed, allowing him to return to his bed with a clean conscience. His brain's salience network immediately flagged this event as a high-priority threat, triggering a fight or flight response that made his heart race and his palms sweat. This was the ultimate test of his neuroplasticity. Could he override the old neural pathway of frustrated abandonment and create a new one of resilient persistence? He felt the old Leo screaming to throw the computer against the wall and give up, but the new Leo, the one forged in the silence of the previous week, felt a strange, icy calm. He realized that the code wasn't the product. The ability to write the code was the product, and that could never be erased by a faulty hard drive. He practiced cognitive reframing, telling himself that rewriting the code would only make the logic tighter and his understanding deeper. This shift in perspective moved the activity from the amygdala, the center of fear, back to the prefrontal cortex, the center of problem solving. He didn't scream, and he didn't cry. He simply took a deep breath and began to look for a solution, a moment of profound inhibitory control. He borrowed an old, slow machine from a neighbor, refusing to let a technicality become a tragedy. The cost of greatness began to manifest as a social tax. As Leo's old friends started to notice his absence and began to pull at the hem of his new identity. They called him with invitations to just one drink or a quick game, their voices filled with the casual gravity of people who are comfortable in their own stagnation. When he declined, he felt the sting of social rejection, a sensation that processed in the same brain regions as physical pain. His friends weren't trying to hurt him, but his growth was a mirror that reflected their own lack of movement, and they unconsciously sought to pull him back down to their level. This is the crab mentality, where the collective ensures that no individual escapes the bucket, protecting the group's shared ego. Leo had to develop social courage, the ability to stand alone in his purpose, even when it meant being misunderstood or mocked by those he once loved. He realized that his lazy heart had been kept alive by a lazy circle, a network of people who validated each other's excuses until the excuses became their reality. By cutting these ties, he was effectively performing a synaptic pruning of his social life, removing the influences that reinforced his weakest impulses. He felt a deep sense of loneliness, but he realized this was the isolation of the initiate, a necessary phase in any hero's journey. He was no longer seeking the cheap dopamine of social approval. He was seeking the expensive serotonin of self-respect. As he sat in the dim light of his borrowed laptop, his fingers flying across the keys, he felt a sense of power he had never known. He was no longer a victim of his circumstances or his biology. He was the architect of his own evolution. The third month of Leo's journey marked the transition from the friction of the start to the momentum of the machine. He began to notice that the mental effort required to sit down and begin his work had dropped significantly, a sign that his basal ganglia had finally accepted this new routine as a hardwired habit. This physical change is largely due to the process of myelination, where a fatty substance called myelin wraps around the frequently used axons in the brain like high-quality electrical insulation. For every hour Leo spent in deep, concentrated focus, his brain was essentially upgrading its wiring from copper to fiber optics, allowing signals to travel faster and with less energy loss. This meant that the metabolic cost of his discipline was decreasing, freeing up more cognitive resources for complex problem solving rather than just self-control. He found himself sliding into flow states more frequently, those golden hours where the self vanishes and the work seems to flow through the hands with a mind of its own. In this state, his brain entered a period of transient hypofrontality, where the over-analytical and self-critical parts of the prefrontal cortex temporarily stepped back. This allowed his subconscious to make lateral connections between disparate ideas that his lazy heart would have never been able to grasp. He was no longer pushing the boulder up the hill. He was starting to feel the gravitational pull of the summit, a sensation that sent steady, rhythmic pulses of dopamine through his system. This was earned dopamine, the kind that builds long-term resilience rather than the spiked dopamine of quick fixes that leads to addiction and decay. He looked at his code and saw a level of elegance and sophistication that felt like it belonged to a different person, a man he had finally earned the right to be. As Leo's internal world stabilized, the external world began to respond to the kinetic energy he was radiating into his environment. He stopped announcing his plans to the world and then started showing proof of concept, a move that shifted his social standing from a dreamer to a practitioner. He released a small, open-source version of his project, and within 48 hours, he received an email from a developer he had admired for years. This external validation acted as a positive feedback loop, further strengthening the neural pathways associated with his work ethic and ambition. However, Leo noticed a subtle danger in this success: the return of the complacency monster that lives in the heart of every achiever. His brain, ever eager to conserve energy, tried to convince him that he had arrived and could now afford to coast on his recent accolades. He felt a slight drop in his hunger, a physiological state where the absence of a threat leads to a decrease in Norepinephrine and a softening of focus. This is the peril of the plateau, where many people stop growing because the pain of their current situation is no longer great enough to drive them. To counter this, Leo practiced voluntary hardship, purposefully taking on a more difficult aspect of the project to keep his stress response system primed. He understood that the brain only stays sharp when it is consistently challenged by desirable difficulties that force it to adapt. He wasn't just working for the result anymore. He was working to maintain the high-performance state of his own biology. He had learned that the lazy heart is never truly dead. It is merely in hibernation, waiting for the first sign of comfort to wake up and reclaim the throne. The physical transformation of Leo was now undeniable to anyone who caught a glimpse of him in the local coffee shop where he occasionally worked. The lazy heart had been replaced by a rhythm of steel, and his movements had a newfound economy and precision that reflected his internal order. His eyes, once glazed with the blue light of aimless consumption, were now sharp and present, a sign of high, attentional control. He had mastered the art of the no, declining any distraction that did not align with the narrow, intense beam of his current mission. This was a triumph of the inhibitory circuits in his brain, which were now strong enough to overrule the impulsive desires of his lower centers. He realized that true freedom wasn't the ability to do anything, but the capacity to do the one thing that mattered most. He began to see his past laziness not as a character flaw, but as a neurological prison that he had finally managed to tunnel out of. The smell of the coffee, the sound of the keyboard, and the sight of the glowing code became a multisensory anchor that triggered an immediate state of readiness. He was no longer waiting for inspiration to strike. He was the one striking the flint of his own discipline to create the spark. As he reached the end of the third month, he looked back at the version of himself that had been paralyzed by a duvet and felt a profound sense of disassociation. That man was a stranger, a ghost of a life that was never lived, a cautionary tale that Leo had narrowly escaped. He was now a creator in the prime of his power, ready to face the ultimate test of his project's launch with a heart that was finally and irrevocably awake. The morning of the launch felt like standing on the edge of a high-altitude precipice where the air is thin and the stakes are absolute. Leo sat in his apartment, which had been transformed from a cavern of neglect into a high-functioning command center, his pulse a steady, rhythmic thrum in his ears. This was the moment of ultimate exposure, a psychological state where the internal project meets the external reality, triggering a massive activation of the hypothalamus-pituitary-adrenal HPA axis. For months, Leo had existed in a vacuum where he was the only judge of his work, but now his dopaminergic baseline was about to be subjected to the volatile whims of public opinion. He felt the familiar pull of imposter syndrome, a cognitive distortion where the brain discounts one's own achievements as a matter of luck rather than skill. This phenomenon is often linked to high activity in the default mode network, the part of the brain that engages in self-referential thought and often gravitates toward self-criticism. He had to manually override these thoughts using metacognitive monitoring, observing the anxiety as a mere chemical storm rather than a fundamental truth. He realized that the lazy heart was making one final desperate stand, attempting to convince him that it was safer to stay hidden than to risk being seen and rejected. But the new Leo understood that safety was just another word for stagnation, and he pressed the button to release his work into the digital wild. The initial response was a terrifying silence, a vacuum that tested his distress tolerance to its absolute limit. Then, the first notification chirped, followed by another, and soon the feedback loop was alive with the sound of a world that was finally paying attention. As the hours passed and the data began to pour in, Leo experienced a phenomenon known as hedonic adaptation, where the brain quickly normalizes a new high-status reality. He had dreamed of this moment for years, imagining that the success would feel like a permanent state of euphoria, but he found that the high was surprisingly fleeting. Within hours, his brain was already looking for the next problem to solve, the next update to push, and the next mountain to climb. This is the hedonic treadmill, a survival mechanism that prevents us from becoming too satisfied with a single win, ensuring we keep striving for more. Leo realized that if he relied on the outcome for his happiness, he would be perpetually chasing a horizon that moved as fast as he ran. He had to pivot his reward system back to the process, finding the intrinsic motivation that comes from the act of creation itself. He saw users pointing out bugs and flaws in his work, and instead of feeling defensive, he felt a surge of glutamatergic excitement at the chance to refine his craft. He was no longer a man with a lazy heart who feared criticism. He was a man with a disciplined heart who ate criticism for breakfast. The responsibility of the dream had settled onto his shoulders, and he found that the weight didn't crush him. It grounded him. He was now an employer of his own time, a steward of his own potential, and a shepherd of a community that relied on his vision. The transformation was complete, but he knew the maintenance was a lifelong contract that could never be voided. The day after the launch, Leo did something the old Leo would have found impossible. He woke up at 5 a.m. and went straight back to work. He didn't take a victory lap, and he didn't indulge in a week-long celebration that would have eroded his hard-won neural pathways. He understood that the myelin he had built was a living structure that required constant reinforcement to prevent synaptic degradation. He looked at his reflection in the same bathroom mirror where he had seen a ghost 3 months prior, and this time the eyes that looked back were solid and clear. He felt a deep sense of self-concordance, the feeling that his actions were perfectly aligned with his deepest values and identity. He had moved from ego involvement, where his self-worth was on the line, to task involvement, where the work was its own reward. The lazy heart was now a distant memory, a cautionary tale he would one day tell to others who were trapped in the same duvet-lined prison. He realized that the greatest lesson life had given him wasn't how to be successful, but how to be useful. Ambition without effort is a toxic gas that poisons the soul, but discipline is the filtration system that turns that gas into pure, life-giving oxygen. He walked to his desk, opened his laptop, and began to work on the next version of his life, his fingers moving with the quiet confidence of a master. The silence in the room was no longer heavy. It was a blank canvas, and he was the one holding the brush. He was no longer a young man with big dreams. He was a man of action, and the world was finally beginning to reflect that reality back to him. 1 year after the launch that redefined his existence, Leo found himself standing in a high-tech boardroom, but the adrenaline of the striver had been replaced by the steady alpha wave state of a seasoned leader. He was no longer just a coder. He was a mentor to a team of engineers, many of whom carried the same shadows of high potential and low effort that had once defined him. This transition required a new form of neural evolution, shifting from self-focused achievement to prosocial contribution, a move that activated his brain's mirror neuron system. This system allows us to understand and empathize with the struggles of others by simulating their experiences within our own neural architecture. When Leo looked at a young developer paralyzed by the fear of a bug, he didn't feel frustration. He felt a resonant hum in his own anterior insula, the part of the brain that processes shared emotional states. He realized that his lazy heart provided him with a unique neuro-intellectual map of the pitfalls that await the gifted. He began to teach his team not just how to optimize code, but how to optimize their prefrontal limbic balance. He explained the Goldilocks rule of motivation, that the brain performs best when a task is not too easy to cause boredom and not too hard to cause anxiety. By helping his team find this sweet spot, he was effectively acting as an external executive function for their developing careers. He was no longer just building software. He was engineering a culture of psychological safety where effort was celebrated more than innate talent. The neuroscience of mentorship also revealed to Leo the concept of generativity, a psychological stage where a person feels a deep-seated need to nurture the next generation. This stage is associated with increased levels of oxytocin, often called the bonding hormone, which helps reduce the stress-inducing effects of cortisol. By investing in his team, Leo was actually lowering his own allostatic load, the wear and tear on the body caused by chronic stress. He found that the dopamine he used to seek through personal accolades was now being replaced by serotonin, the chemical of social belonging and status. He watched as his youngest intern, a girl with brilliant ideas but a lazy heart of her own, finally pushed through a week of grueling debugging to emerge victorious. In that moment, Leo felt a surge of vicarious reward that was more potent than any of his own previous successes. This is the helper's high, a neurological phenomenon where altruism triggers the brain's reward centers in a more sustainable way than selfish gain. He was teaching them that the friction they felt wasn't a wall, but a stepping stone that was thickening the myelin in their own brains. He had become a synaptic bridge, connecting the raw potential of his team to the grounded reality of disciplined output. His legacy was no longer written in lines of code, but in the neural pathways of the people he had helped to wake up. As the sun set on the first anniversary of his company, Leo sat alone in his office, looking at the city lights and reflecting on the long game of human potential. He realized that the lazy heart is not a permanent curse, but a phase of resistance that most people simply never choose to outgrow. He had learned that the prefrontal cortex can be trained just like a bicep, and that willpower is not an infinite resource, but a skill that must be managed with wisdom. He thought about Elias, who was now a close friend and collaborator, and realized that they were no longer plotter and genius. They were simply two men who had chosen to pay the metabolic price of their dreams every single day without fail. The bitter truth he had faced in that bathroom mirror a year ago had become the sweetest victory of his life. He felt a sense of ego transcendence, where his identity was no longer tied to being the best, but to being the most useful. The lazy heart had been a heavy anchor, but he had used it to build a foundation that was now unshakable. He picked up a pen and wrote a single sentence on a sticky note for the next morning. The work is the only reward that doesn't fade. He walked out of the office, his step light but purposeful, a man who had finally discovered that the true secret to success is in wanting it more, but doing it more. The deep mind he had cultivated was now his greatest asset, a well-oiled machine that would never again settle for the poverty of potential. 5 years into his journey, Leo's transformation had reached a state of neurological homeostasis, where discipline was no longer a conscious choice, but the very fabric of his identity. This is the stage of unconscious competence, where the complex coordination between the motor, cortex, and the prefrontal centers happens with minimal metabolic overhead. He no longer woke up and asked himself if he felt like working. His brain's salience network had been permanently recalibrated to view effort as the highest form of pleasure. He had built what neuroscientists call neural reserve, a robust architecture of brain density and connectivity that acts as a buffer against stress and aging. While his peers were beginning to experience the cognitive slowing that comes with a life of passive consumption, Leo's brain was becoming more efficient and more integrated. He had mastered the art of attentional shifting, the ability to move his focus from the granular details of a project to the high-level strategy without losing momentum. This flexibility is governed by the executive control network, which in Leo had become as responsive as a high-performance engine. He realized that the lazy heart he once possessed was simply a lack of neural infrastructure, a problem that couldn't be solved with a wish, only with a sledgehammer of consistency. He had moved beyond the need for external motivation, finding that the internal fire of a well-ordered mind was more than enough to keep him warm. The ego that used to crave the spotlight had been replaced by a soul that craved the solution, a shift that brought a profound sense of peace. Leo began to study the concept of long-term potentiation, or LTP, the process by which synaptic connections become stronger the more they are activated. He realized that his 5 years of work hadn't just produced a company. They had literally thickened the reality of his own consciousness. Every time he chose the difficult path over the easy one, he was physically widening the channels of his willpower, making future discipline even easier to access. He looked at his life and saw that the chaos of his early 20s had been replaced by a symphony of deliberate action and restorative rest. He had learned the neuroscience of recovery, understanding that sleep and meditation were not escapes from work, but the reloading of the brain's chemical magazines. By protecting his circadian hygiene, he ensured that his adenosine levels were perfectly managed, allowing him to maintain peak focus throughout the day. He was a living testament to the idea that freedom is the byproduct of a well-constructed internal prison of rules and values. Without the walls of discipline, the liquid potential of his life would have just leaked away into the dirt of mediocrity. No, that potential was a pressurized stream that could cut through the hardest problems the world could throw at him. He felt a deep, quiet gratitude for the bitter Tuesday that had started it all, realizing that pain is often just wisdom trying to get our attention. He was no longer running away from his lazy heart. He had taught it how to beat for something bigger than itself. As he looked toward the future, Leo understood that the greatest threat to his permanent mindset was the very success he had worked so hard to achieve. The brain's reward system is notoriously fickle, and victory can often lead to a drop in the anticipatory dopamine that drives growth. To prevent this stagnation of the winner, he began to set impossible goals that forced his brain back into a state of positive stress or eustress. He understood that a brain that isn't growing is, by definition, dying, and he was determined to be a student until the day he drew his last breath. He began to mentor other CEOs, teaching them that culture is just group neurobiology and that laziness is a contagious virus that must be quarantined. He spoke at universities, telling the students that their talents were useless burdens if they didn't have the character to carry them. He told them the story of John, a fictionalized version of his old self, to show them that the lazy heart can be cured, but the surgery is performed without an anesthetic. He was now a shaper of reality, a man who had earned the right to speak because he had first done the work in the dark. The deep mind he had cultivated was now a beacon for others, a reminder that the ghost of potential can be given flesh and bone through the power of the grind. He walked out onto his balcony, looking at the horizon, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to be anywhere else. He was exactly where he was supposed to be, because he had walked every single mile of the way. The final evolution of Leo's journey is not a destination, but a state of perpetual, rhythmic motion that we call the blueprint of the awakened will. Standing at the pinnacle of his career, Leo looked back and realized that the lazy heart he once feared was actually a mismanaged neurobiological resource. He had learned that the human brain is not a static vessel, but a dynamic, self-sculpting organ that responds to the demands of its environment. The prefrontal cortex is the sculptor, the limbic system is the raw clay, and discipline is the steady, repetitive pressure of the hand that shapes the form. He understood that every human being is born with a biological debt of survival instincts that prioritize ease, but we are also born with a divine surplus of conscious intent. The bridge between the two is the effort-based reward system, a circuit that must be manually activated through the friction of difficult work. He saw that most people spend their lives waiting for the feeling of motivation to arrive, not realizing that action is the chemical precursor to the feeling, not the result of it. This is the synthesis of the grind, the moment when you realize that the discomfort of the work is actually the feeling of your brain upgrading its own operating system. He had moved from a fixed mindset, where he was a victim of his innate traits, to a growth mindset, where he was the master of his own neural destiny. This shift was not a one-time event, but a cellular commitment that had to be renewed with every sunrise. To leave a map for those still trapped in the fog of the duvet, Leo codified his transformation into a Neuro-Action Protocol that he shared with the world. He taught that one must first starve the distraction, physically removing the high dopamine triggers that keep the brain in a state of reactive impulsivity. Second, one must embrace the friction, recognizing that the initial pain of starting a task is simply the basal ganglia resisting a change in the status quo. Third, he emphasized temporal reframing, the ability to pull the future consequences of inaction into the present moment to trigger the amygdala's protective drive. Fourth, he advocated for micro-dosing success, breaking massive goals into units so small that the nucleus accumbens can register a win every single hour. Finally, he stressed the importance of identity anchoring, where you stop saying, "I am trying to be disciplined," and start saying, "I am a person who does the hard work." This linguistic shift changes the way the medial prefrontal cortex processes self-referential information, making the discipline a matter of integrity rather than willpower. He explained that a lazy heart is simply a heart that hasn't been given a reason to beat fast, and that ambition is the fuel, but habit is the engine. By following this blueprint, any ghost of potential could manifest into a solid, undeniable reality. He was living proof that the neuroplasticity of the human spirit is the most powerful force in the known universe. As the final credits roll on the story of Leo, we see him sitting at his desk, the same one where the journey began, but the atmosphere is entirely different. The silence of the room is now filled with the vibration of purpose, a low, steady frequency that comes from a life fully lived. He looks at a photo of his younger self, the man with the heavy eyes and the lazy heart, and feels a profound sense of compassion for that stranger. He realizes that laziness is often just a mask for terror, and that discipline is the only true cure for the fear of being inadequate. He has turned his dreams into data, his fantasies into frameworks, and his potential into power. The lesson he learned is one that echoes through every fiber of our biology, that the universe does not reward intellect or intention. It only rewards impact. He is no longer a young man with a big heart and a lazy soul. He is a man whose heart and soul are in perfect synchronized motion. The deep mind is no longer a goal he is chasing. It is the ground he stands on, the air he breathes, and the legacy he leaves behind. He picks up his pen, not to dream, but to execute, because he knows that the only thing standing between a man and his destiny is the labor he is currently avoiding. He is awake, he is ready, and for the first time in his life, he is truly, fundamentally free. If you're ready to stop haunting your own life and start engineering your own destiny, join our community of thinkers. Hit subscribe and let's rewire your mind together.